Hi, everyone. This is your host, Annie Zhang, and this is Hello, Metaverse. While architects have had so much influence on how our cities, buildings, and social spaces are constructed, their influence has not quite reached the virtual world. This is perhaps why we haven't seen examples in the metaverse of landmarks, versatile multi-purpose spaces, or places that have outlived the specific game, use case, or event that it was created for. Lara Lesmes and Fredrik Hellberg of Space Popular are pioneers within the architectural field, having developed curiosity for what virtual reality will emerge to become years before anyone was ever talking about the metaverse. They integrate their expertise in traditional architecture with speculative and conceptual work to help people imagine where the future may be headed. Their perspective is unique, especially for the world of consumer tech, and really helps create a completely new paradigm for thinking. In this episode, we cover a breadth of fascinating topics, from the architectural point of view and how it transitions from traditional architecture to how it should be thought about in a limitless virtual realm, to a vision of the future where architecture will happen at the speed of the spoken word, to why portals will become one of the most common design elements moving forward, the same way that cars really governed design in the past era. A bit more about Space Popular. It is a research-driven art, design, and media studio that explores the future of spatial experience through virtual reality, film, exhibitions, speculative writing, as well as buildings and objects. Clients, collaborators, and commissioners include national institutions such as MAXI, the Swedish Center for Architecture and Design, Royal Institute of British Architects, and the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul. Lara and Fredrik are also currently part of the Daniels Faculty of Architecture in the University of Toronto and the UCLA Architecture and Urban Design. As a disclosure, all opinions and points of view in this podcast are my own. It does not represent the views of Roblox, my current employer, and is not affiliated with the company. I learned so much from this interview, and I hope you will too. Here is my conversation with Lara and Fredrik from Space Popular. I'm super excited to dive in because you guys come from an architectural background, and that is a unique lens that I think audiences have not really heard from on this podcast yet. So to start, can you help people understand the architectural school of thought? What has been the traditional role of architecture? What are typically the problems that you seek to solve through architecture, and how that's starting to evolve into potentially influencing the virtual world?
Well, very generally, architecture is about making buildings, so that historically has been very much about making physical buildings. However, the way we look at it, both from the point of architectural theory, but also in practice, there has been, for time indefinite almost, there has been little experiments here and there has been periods of time also where there has been a strong interest in basically creating space out of nowhere. So we are very inspired by that tradition of buildings trying to be almost there, but not quite there, or spaces appearing out of nowhere in buildings, that being frescoes, that being tapestries, that being mirrors, reflections, transparencies. And at the same time, also in architectural theory has in certain periods, a close relationship with philosophy and certain schools of thought in philosophy. So, for example, in the 90s, I think very inspired by the wave of VR that there was then. There were also quite a lot of experiments in architecture, or a lot of speculative projects that were not thought of to being realized, but just like developing ideas around issues of virtual space.
So walk me through an example of something that's a bit more of a traditional architectural approach of here's how I'm going to think about building this building, or here's how I'm going to envision how this community space is going to come together physically, and then talk about how you start to deviate from that when you're thinking of a new construct from nowhere.
One of the really big differences perhaps with architecture and other disciplines, especially other creative disciplines, because that's certainly our point of view here with being architects and having studied architecture, is that you always have to have an incredibly long time span when you're thinking about creating physical buildings, where if you build a building, even if it's a house or almost whatever it is, you will most likely not live as long as that building will live. So somehow you need to always keep in mind that you cannot be in full control over how this space is going to be used, which means that you really need to have an open mind of really being inclusive to as many scenarios as possible. And that's really quite a unique kind of point of view that's almost forced upon architects, but it's what makes it really exciting. And it kind of also generally among architects, and hopefully among architects, creates a sense of responsibility, which is quite unique when it comes to architects starting to work to create virtual spaces or spaces for the metaverse, because quite often they will have this point of view of imagining not just, okay, we're building the stage to give it an award and then we're dismantling it, that's it. Or we're building this virtual environment for one event and then that's it, we pull the plug afterwards. Whereas it's almost difficult for an architect to untrain this thinking about it being flexible for as many situations as possible, which is often why style is such a divisive topic in architecture. Every building to some degree has a style, and throughout history they always have styles, but it very much cements a building in a time, and we associate certain buildings depending on what they look like with certain either political views or moments in history. So when working in virtual environments and for the metaverse, this completely shifts, because of course it's still very time consuming to create a virtual space, but nowhere close as time consuming as it is to create a physical building.
Right.
And it doesn't involve as many people, it doesn't involve as many resources, which means that buildings and spaces can all of a sudden function many other purposes than what a physical building would often have to do. Keeping out the weather, keeping you safe, keeping your possessions safe, depending on what type of building it happens to be in, or represent the people if it's a public building or whatever it is. Whereas in theory, a virtual building can serve the purpose of a joke only, and then you pull the plug and it's gone. We often speak of a scenario that we foresee for the future, let's say in the next 30 years or so, as AI gets cheaper and more available, that we will have architecture at the speed of the spoken word. So literally as fast as you can speak space will manifest. And it's the complete reversal of how an architect is trained to think. And we're really excited to be part of this slow but also fast change of starting to work for virtual environments.
Yeah, there is also one point that I think might be nice to add to this. That is the notion that when you are designing buildings, I think it connects very much to what Fredrik was saying with regards to having a certain versatility, because it will probably survive you, your building. There is also this sense of like you are designing something that provides a certain spatial experience, that has certain features, but yet it's background. No, it remains in the background for other things to happen within. And that balance is something you get really used to. Like, okay, I need to provide something. In many cases, like the building needs to be almost like an icon and still needs to enable an indefinite amount of things happening within it. So I think this notion of designing spaces that are meant to be background, or designing platforms that to a certain extent are going to be background and quite versatile, is very much part of our approach. And we find that, for example, when working with spaces for like social VR spaces, it's really interesting because there doesn't need to be a particular mission or something you need to do. You just need a space in order to create context. And doing that is quite difficult because it's not really a problem to resolve. It's purely almost like an art project. It's purely a design. I mean, design is not even the right word. It's purely an aesthetic exercise.
That is really interesting. I really like this idea of, architecture to create a backdrop or context for things to happen, but compounded with the fact that it has to have lasting power. You can't quite predict what are all of the things that people are going to use that context for. So speaking of which, I have been a proponent of speaking about how a lot of metaverse development so far has been not architecturally driven enough, right? There's a lot of product designers, there's a lot of 3D artists and stuff like that. And so far it's been more driven by just imagination and sort of graphics and art, and then also product design, which is more about problem solving, right? It's like, what does the user need to accomplish and how are we going to help them accomplish that? So talk to us about how then the architectural modality gets applied. What changes once you start to think more about the backdrop, the environment, the context? Like, how does that shift maybe how spaces look like today in the metaverse to what it could potentially become in a more complex way in the future?
it often, I guess, comes from the background that people have who are actually building virtual spaces. And if you consider virtual buildings and virtual architecture actual architecture, which we do, then the vast majority has not been built by architects, certainly. And even the vast majority of architecture, period, in the last 20 years have been built to be experienced virtually in games and films, etc., to some degree. And that's where all of the tools that we use come from. And the tools that most architects use, especially for representing their work, comes from the entertainment industry or from gaming industry. So no matter what happens, these are already being weaved together, these disciplines and these backgrounds, where the sort of architectural point of view is by necessity shifting to accommodate itself in the workflows that are developed now with these technologies, but also, I mean, more generally in ideology or more sort of ways that architecture is created from the point of view of like how it's intended to be used. And quite often throughout history, architecture or architects have had either a strong influence in a very new technology or not so strong. And it's sort of gone up and down. There's moments in history where like architects were not really involved and moments in history when architects were very involved. For instance, something that's been a bit invisible perhaps for the bigger kind of larger public is architecture that is driven through parametric systems, meaning parts of the architecture is not actually specifically designed by a human, but you build computational systems in which either complex geometries are sort of self-arrangeable or where structural systems are sort of computed by using parametric systems.
It's generative.
Yeah, generative structures. And there's plenty of buildings all around the world that have been done in this way. And even the way that hotel floor plans are laid out, they're often parametric, where you mean like you can shift. If I move this toilet over here, then all of the other ones kind of arranged accordingly. So this is an example of where architects were really involved in building these tools, building the ways that this happens. Whereas today, when it comes to the rolling out of the design and the tools to make virtual spaces accessible and to create them, architects have generally not been so involved, which is why also where like people coming from the gaming industry or other industries are perhaps even more influential in what this architecture is like.
Interesting. Talk to us a bit more about the involvement so far of architecture in film and traditional gaming, because I don't think that that's at least something that I know that much about.
I don't think there is that much. In film there is, yeah. I mean, stage designers, architects have been set designers for, there is several examples of that. Maybe one of the nicest is Ken Adams, right?
Ken Adams designed several, but actually I don't think he was an architect. But
he wasn't an architect? I assume so. No, I think because we're always talking about him in architecture.
Designed loads of the sort of bombastic scenes from 70s James Bond movies and several Stanley Kubrick movies, etc.
So in fact, there has not been. What is happening now is this interesting moment when architecture is absorbing so many of the tools that are actually built for game design. I mean, like so many architects are now trained in game engines such as Unreal, or Unity. Yeah, because it's incredibly powerful. And of course, like headsets, the moment the current wave of headsets became available, as a spatial designer, I think it's impossible not to be keen to use it. So of course, like the 3D modeling tools are often maybe different because we work with, for building buildings, you work with 3D modeling tools that have other degrees of precision. They work in a different way. You work with other types of modeling and so on. But now there's definitely like architecture visualization is full on embracing all the virtual reality tools. So it's been quite a revolution. And that means that you have a new generation of architects that are ready to work for the immersive industry.
So when architecture is at its best, it takes into account, as Lara was saying, the fact that it is actually something that is in the background. It's a peripheral thing where the focus should be what humans do in architecture, not the architecture itself. And when architecture is at its best, that's what it focuses on. And with this long view again of how communities form, not just this week, but over generations. And that's something that we think is desperately needed in the design and the forming of the immersive internet or the metaverse, that maybe other disciplines do not have, certainly that kind of way of thinking, where we think that, and we hope that, as disciplines merge and start to collaborate more and more, that this very necessary view that architects have can also serve a purpose for the creation of the metaverse.
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, going back also to part of your question to do also with, like, how do you go about solving a problem? When you're studying architecture, I think quite broadly, one could say that most architecture schools, there is always this push that, like, you might be given a brief, but then you're always designing your own brief, no? So you're always undoing, like, you're always scrutinizing what you are being told to do to see if that's really the thing that should be done, and that maybe you can help at another level of the project, which I think is something incredibly necessary and incredibly healthy, because a lot of public money has been spent in totally unnecessary buildings that someone should have questioned what that building should have even been for, and where should all that money go? So there is this degree of responsibility that comes with being trained as an architect that I know maybe doesn't apply to all practicing architects, sadly. But with that, I also wanted to get to this notion of being comfortable with a design process where you don't have to go too quickly into problem solving. Often you find designers that don't like being faced with uncertainty, with a blank page. I think a lot of the virtual platforms that are built today are very much blank pages. We don't know what they are for. There is no problem to solve. And maybe we don't need to push problems into them to solve them, right? We don't need to push missions into them in order to design for them. But perhaps we can feel more comfortable with the ambiguity of creating a place and see where it goes, see where it evolves, which actually social media platforms maybe is partly the way in which they have developed, no? It's something, you put it out there and then you go with the flow of it. But it feels like when, designing virtual spaces, there is, in a sense, more work involved in the beginning, no? Of designing the whole space, creating that whole environment. So I do think that will be necessary, especially when for this immersive social spaces, where we don't know where they are headed, and you don't really know what's going to happen in there. Or maybe you start with some events and then the space develops into something else on its own. But then I think that it's important to embrace that, to feel a bit more comfortable with that degree of uncertainty, where the design process is not necessarily problem solving, but is more driven by creating a space that expresses something, but that can also fit many things.
That's pretty powerful and super different. I think a lot of product designers might be listening to this and they'll be like paralyzed. So speaking of which, like, what is that process then? So if you are dealing with more ambiguity, you're allowing yourself to be more open to the possibilities of what could emerge. What are some of those things that you do latch on? What are those fundamental principles? And maybe describe an actual project that you guys have worked on around virtual spaces.
It would be nice to talk about two projects in parallel, one that is a physical building and one that is a virtual space, because they have followed similar processes for very different reasons, obviously. We designed a residential building, a house, that was for a developer, so it was going to be sold. We didn't know who was the client, and all we wanted to define was basically a construction system that, because of the way that the house is constructed, provides certain features. In this case, we were using brick vaults. So we were creating these floor slabs that were actually quite efficient, but they also created this feature of, like, you had a brick vault in every room. And it's like, okay, well, that creates enough of a feature, but it also gives enough space for whoever will come to live in here to deploy their own life and identity and aesthetics into this place. And also the way the floor plans were designed, they were very systematic according to a grid, so that we would resolve all the construction details that then we could apply to other houses that the developer might want to do, but with different configurations, right? So that was a way of, like, not having too much of a brief, but creating something, and at the same time creating a project that can grow, or a project that can be something else. And then in parallel to this, on the virtual side, I was going to bring up the Arquea project, which is a project that we did for Fundación Arquea, which is a foundation here in Spain for architects, actually, to deliver awards. They wanted to have a virtual event like most people during the pandemic, but they didn't want it to just be conference calls. So we created this WebXR space using Mozilla Hubs and creating our own custom client based on the Hubs stack. And that there was a very simple brief, but it was really rich, because they wanted to, that year, the event was planned to take place in Barcelona, in Spain. So they wanted a hint of that. And that was really interesting because I don't know if people is aware, but Barcelona has this quite well-known city plan that was the first very famous grid plan. All architects know about this. And we took that system as a means to create basically the circulation in between rooms, even if you were actually entering new rooms, because otherwise it was getting too heavy for WebXR. But we created that layout, and with that, we created a series of rooms that had certain hints of Barcelona that were basically, they were just like open squares surrounded by buildings. We could create an endless amount of these rooms, and at the same time, we could also create an endless amount of space with this grid, right? You could continue going through this. So developing a sort of construction or assembly or map system that at the same time has enough features to provide a recognizable spatial experience is, I think, what puts these two projects for me together. And we are very often asked, like, how do you work in both physical space and virtual space if they don't seem to have anything in common? And for us, they have some, like, you can use very similar strategies to deal with both.
And the thing that Lara was just mentioning is perhaps one of the most important aspects or principles when designing virtual spaces for the metaverse. In our experience, having designed quite a few, and it also is part of, we recently published a manifesto or a series of propositions specifically for moving around in virtual environments and virtual environments themselves. And one of those principles that we think is extremely important is recognizability, or symbolism and relatability. And quite often you get responses when you see virtual spaces, virtual architecture, like, why does it look like real buildings when it's virtual? It can be anything. But we really think that in the long term, the long view, in order for communities to build and for people to feel comfortable, which is much more important than people having awesome experiences. There's plenty of awesome experiences around, but there's not so many spaces that creates a sense of where communities can really build over time. And for that to be possible, they need to be recognizable, and people need to be able to step into these environments and see, oh, it's a square, and I know how squares work, or furniture or objects or other architectural elements that we often see in virtual environments. Even a cloud, people can assume that you can sit on a cloud if it's virtual potentially, but the more recognizable it is, the more stronger foundation it has for communities to build. So I think that's probably one of the most key principles that we've discovered through our work.
Yeah, I really like that, which is you've spoken a lot about how there needs to be familiarity in order for people to want to inhabit a new place, because otherwise it's just going to be too isolating or different. And value assignment, you need to understand why certain things are valuable, and you need to know that other people have that same paradigm of thinking about value. So right now with the metaverse, we're actually in a phase where I think we're doing a lot of that. People are almost creating digital twins of the physical world. People are in Sandbox taking things really literally, right? Like they're building a mansion, they're building, a beach or like a pool party and stuff like that. So how do we start to emerge a little bit out of that, where it's a balance of familiarity but still understanding that the metaverse has very different constraints, or maybe lack thereof. Physics is not really a part of it. Limited resources is not really a part of it as well. Transportation is not really a problem. How do we evolve out of the current state that we're in right now?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting here is to listen to what our instincts to what to do in the metaverse are teaching us back, because not just what you do yourself, but like what everybody is doing. I think it's incredibly telling when you see, like, okay, so these people needed this space to do whatever activity they want to do, and they felt the urge to create this type of environment that is maybe resembling a conference center. It's like, well, what does that tell us about the value of the conference center in physical space? What this means is that, like, for example, we love the example of the chair. Why are there chairs in virtual space? You would have to align your chair in your house in order to actually sit in it. And then still, like, well, you could be sitting in midair, right? But that maybe you could argue that is awkward and you would need a chair. Still, maybe not enough reason to have it. However, what the virtual chairs are telling us is that the physical chair is doing much more than just providing a place for you to sit on. It's actually an affordance that is affording meaning, in the sense of, like, when I choose to sit in the front row of a conference, I am signaling that I am committing to this. I am going to be sitting here. I am going to be paying attention. I am here on the front to support you, right? And this applies to all kinds of configurations, all kinds of layouts, and also all kinds of spaces. Like when we see that people is creating certain types of places in VR for certain activities, I think that's telling us a lot of what that place is doing in physical reality that maybe we were not so aware of. And in parallel to this, I think also a path to, or like a method that we really like in order to think about how do you start breaking from the metaphor or the analog, the analogy and so on, is to use almost like the surrealist method, which is not just to do something insane. It's usually to create a very, very recognizable situation and twist one thing. And that is incredibly powerful. I always keep bringing up the surrealist films, some examples of like Spanish surrealist film directors like Luis Buñuel, who has these movies that are so, so powerful because they do that, right? They set a very well-known scenario and they change one thing. And it's in that contrast when we can actually understand what happens when you change that one variable. And I think one variable at a time is the way that we will reach this other place that maybe the metaverse itself wants to be. But I don't think we can from scratch think about something totally new and totally different. As a designer, I find that like an impossible task. It's like you come up with something totally new. The only thing that designers are doing is probably maybe putting two things together that have never been put together, but you're not going to come up with something absolutely novel from scratch. So I think that could be also a useful approach.
That makes a lot of sense. I think the really common saying of constraints breeds creativity, right? You can't change everything and work under no constraints at all in order to produce something valuable. So I want to talk a bit more about what are some of those future constructs that you are imagining and you're starting to play around with in your work. I think there's kind of two directions. There's some that doesn't necessarily rely on maybe VR or like a super spatial experience to work. So I know you've done a lot of things around hyperlinks and portals and understanding how people kind of transport through different spaces, but also you do a lot of work within the VR space as well, which is really like thinking through a spatial construct. So maybe talk to us a little bit about both of those pieces of work and how to think about it.
Actually, most of our work around this area generally has been speculative projects in the form of exhibitions at museums and galleries, which is where we use VR headsets often. And often in those settings, we produce scenarios that questions what the future of cities or what the future of architecture will be, depending on what the project is about. And then on the other side, we also create actual virtual spaces, both for clients and for galleries and museums that are very much used right now. And then quite often in 2D formats through screens, etc., but also through VR.
Some of the other concepts or things that like what Fredrik was mentioning, usually the way we approach this is that either we take a case or a city and we start thinking through what will be its augmented version or its VR mixed reality version and so on. And we also developed this notion of the Venn room that we have developed a film around, an immersive film. And now we will be launching the second immersive film about this concept in the beginning of June, actually, in Milan. And that, for example, is just taking the very simple notion that when you come together with somebody in VR, if you want to have an understanding of where that person's barriers are, ideally you would see that person's house as well, right? So you start creating what we call a Venn room, which is literally like a Venn diagram of two homes, no? Or a Venn diagram of two rooms. So that is a sort of new architectural typology. And how does one go about resolving that? What is a good Venn room, which is basically the same as saying, like, what is a good way of overlapping people's spaces for them to share? Are they going to share it for a very long time, or are they going to share it just for 5 minutes? In that case, is it very different? If they share it for a long time, does it become its own place that is meaningful for them and they would want to keep it? In which case, where do they host it, right? And so on and so forth. Like, what relationship does it have with the home, which is very much an intimate space? So that, for example, is a sort of idea that we develop.
Yeah, and quite often, so we sort of try to look at what's happening in the world and then to imagine what will happen in the near or distant future. And then we create scenarios or project that tries to help to create some meaningful context where people can understand what the scenario might mean for cities or for buildings or for just the way we live. So the Venn room is a good example, because if indeed, as we think, more and more people are going to start using headsets that will be cheaper and easier to use, then it will have a massive impact on the way we choose our homes and the way that we choose to decorate them, or the way that we choose to, because if they're literally broadcasted all the time, which is what probably will happen in the next 20 to 30 years, then we might literally choose to buy certain furniture because we know that our best friend or our partner or our parents in a different city or a different continent even has the same ones. And then when we're using VR together, then we can sit in the same posture, or we can actually have dinner together, or whatever it is we want to do together. So that's a good example of something we realize that it's going to have an enormous impact on so many industries and so many different facets of society. And this sort of goes with the sort of projects that we do. So also another example, before we go into the example of the Portal project, is a recent project called Freestyle, which looks at the history of style in architecture and how it's linked to the evolution of media over the last 500 years. So literally from the invention of the printing press and the book and onward to photography, television, cinema, internet, and so on. And that's another example where we look at the evolution of style and what style is really for, and then predicting or looking at sort of the next 30 years or so, when, as we mentioned earlier, that architecture and space will probably be able to be created at the speed of the spoken word. And what does space mean if it's literally just serving the communication between people? And then is when style really becomes like not just a language that can communicate the sort of ideas of a past generation. If you go to a city and look at a building that's 200 years old, often you would look at ornaments and you can read a lot into what those people that built that building had to say about what things were valuable. But if that is instead something that you're communicating in this moment, it's also going to have a revolutionary impact on the way that we read our physical spaces around us. So this kind of goes very much hand in hand with sort of the way that we like to structure projects and the way that we like to structure sort of these speculations to ideally become sort of meaningful milestones for people to be able to prepare and imagine, and in some cases quite direct kind of calls to action to urbanists or city planners or the general public to like both prepare yourself for this extremely weird future we're about to live in, but also to perhaps really think about what are the most important things that we need to keep in mind considering these strange futures that we're about to live in.
I think creation at the speed of communication is one of the most mind-blowing concepts that I've heard in a while. So can you elaborate a little bit more? I like the idea of grounding it with architecture has really moved with how media has evolved.
There is a lot of interesting background of this sort of older, but also very recent examples of what media is doing to and for architectural style. And there is a really interesting moment in architectural history, which is when the printing press becomes more widely available and books on architecture can travel. There's a wonderful quote by the architecture theorist Mario Carpo that is that before the book, buildings could not travel, so people had to.
But literally the only way to experience a building was to go see the person, because there was no photography. There was people probably couldn't afford drawings. And if you were lucky enough to see a painting of a building, it was extremely, extremely rare.
So the book becomes the vehicle for the architectural style. For basically buildings can now travel within that medium, which is so much faster, right? And then you start thinking about mediums, about hardware in that way. Like, for example, tapestry is fascinating, right? You come and roll your tapestry, and that tapestry contains all of these stories. It serves you as a reminder to retell those stories, but it's also like is taking itself is like the USB of those times. Like, here is this bit of information contained in this piece of woven thread. So when you start looking at the different mediums and how fast it was to record in them, what could be recorded, did they transport image or not? It's very interesting to see that like the first architecture books were all words. They had no images on them. And the moment they had images, which is a very significant book by Sebastiano Serlio that had images and was also written in Italian, which was a more common language than Latin, which would have been what they were written in before. Suddenly you get this explosion of Renaissance style and this, can travel.
And this relates then to, if you look at, for instance, the way that VR chat is used today, or where we see like examples of where like people will often change avatar just to make a joke or just to change the setting. Right. And this is the beginning of what we call architecture at the speed of the spoken word, or basically experience at the speed of the spoken word. Or you might world hop. So if you hang out with friends, you might visit 10 or 15 or 20 worlds, and simply because you change the mood or like you're talking about something, let's go to a beach location, or let's go to an apartment, or let's go somewhere else. And you change the avatar depending on.
In terms of design and communication in between maybe designers and clients and so on, there is one platform that is so key, that is Pinterest. Within architecture, maybe because architects tend to get maybe very snobbish, architects hate it when their clients send in a Pinterest board. But maybe people is not realizing that this is the most eloquent way of expressing something that you may not have words to describe, right? Which is, what kind of kitchen do I want, right? Or what kind of virtual space do I want? And it's really interesting because it's all about pattern recognition, right? You put as many images as you can, and I start to understand what is that thing that you are after that maybe we don't have a word for. We are creating style even if before we know what the style is, just by putting all this together. This comes from the tradition of Abby Warburg, who worked on these boards as well, where images were being put together, and doing so, basically a message is conveyed, or a new concept emerges just by putting a lot of these things together. So if we start imagining the spatial version of Pinterest, it's just so fascinating, no? And it starts being this like experiencing space at the speed of the spoken word, because you are going through images almost at the speed of thinking, right? When you are navigating like this, and you are forming thoughts and communicating those thoughts at that speed. And like we have figured out the grid with navigation, with tabs, how this can work in the screen format, which comes from the tradition of paper, which comes from the tradition of that type of hardware. Now we are sort of pushing through the screen, entering it, and we're in a completely new realm that doesn't belong to the tradition of paper, that belongs to the tradition of buildings. And how do we do that? I think that we are nearly there. It's just like the big issue, or like the big problem to solve. The big question is, how do you experience something like that? Will you go through one space and then another? Will they be like a corridor? I don't know.
Which is where the research into Portal comes in. Right, yeah.
Yes, sorry, we like completely went somewhere else, and we still wanted to tell you about the portals. Yes.
Mind completely blown. Well, we're going to get into the portals, but what I want to say is this really reminds me of, have you guys seen Everything Everywhere All at Once?
Oh, yeah.
That movie yet?
I saw it in Toronto.
So wonderful.
I just saw it this weekend. I was mind blown, but this girl who was kind of strapped in every single universe, she was like an omnipresent being that was able to tap into every possibility in the universe. We're just like shape-shifting, creating all of these possibilities and outcomes all at the same time. And it really sounds like the concept you're describing.
Yeah. And there's a wonderful sort of quote from an interview that the directors and the creators of that film, they were saying that like part of this sort of readiness of audiences to take on this really, really complex stories is that in many ways we're already living in a sort of multiverse through media, like through the fact that our minds are constantly bent into other realities, other times, other spaces, even if our body doesn't actually move in magical ways, but our perception does. And we're already like confronted by that sort of experience that the character has in that film, but just through electronic or digital media.
Right. We're constantly disembodied and not really physically where we are because we're mentally somewhere else already. Let's talk about portals. So how does all of this lead to the work that you've been doing around portals?
Yeah. Yes. So this is our most recent research project that we're kind of structuring in similar ways as past projects. It will be exhibited at the Sir John Soane Museum in London, which is a small but really incredible museum in London, UK. And really similar to the other project that we described earlier, we realized that the more research we do and the more we build spaces for the metaverse, we realized that increasingly the way we move from one world to another, from one space to another, or the way that we shift environments, those mechanisms are going to be absolutely crucial for the things that will be possible and how communities can form, etc. And we realized that when you bring your body into a medium, like in VR or any form of immersive media, you need anchor points, or you need a kind of understandable and recognizable or relatable way for these shifts to happen. And we really think...
a transition or a threshold of some kind.
Yeah. And we realized that portals will probably become one of the most sort of common design elements in the coming decades and centuries, where like it will be like the way that the car in the past century was the design object of this whole era, where portals will probably become like, we'll have entire floors of buildings, just people designing portals for the metaverse. When thinking about this, we really realized through the way we work that if this is going to happen, we really need to understand where we're coming from. And since portals everyone has a relationship to portals, to magical portals that we see in fiction. We've seen them in films and video games. We read about them. And no matter if you're interested in fiction specifically, almost everyone has some relationship to it. If it's the portals in Alice in Wonderland or Narnia or Harry Potter or Halo or whatever video games or whatever world we're talking about here, because they will in one way or another become the sort of blueprint on which we start to continue to build real portals for the metaverse. So the project is a research project that spans the past 2 years. We've created a database that includes about 1,000 portals in fiction, from mainly focusing on the last 70 years. So roughly from the end of the Second World War onwards, but it also looks basically a sort of 150-year time period. The database and the archive basically looks at these portals, both from the point of view of where they were created, in what context, in what medium were they told in, but also what function these portals serve in the narrative. So are they used as weapons? Are they used as places to hide? Or are they used as
escape routes or
to create an infrastructure for the world that's being told in the narrative?
Privileged access to a certain place where you're the chosen one and so on, right? They serve all these different purposes and they take different forms. So one of the most interesting aspects that, I mean, we're trying to create conclusions, even if it's going to be ongoing, still, obviously it's never going to be completed, but we started to see archetypes within this that will be a big part of the exhibition. Basically this number of archetypes where you start getting a sense for like, well, these are the X number of types that we can identify, and therefore probably any portal that you start doing is going to be based in one of those types. And if you have an understanding of the history of that typology, then you are more likely to really predict or be conscious of the ways in which it might be read, right? How is the person who's going to be visiting or who's going to be using it, who's going to be traveling through this portal? What could be the implications? Not just like, will it be easy to use? Will it be understandable? But also like, what will be potential cultural implications of creating things in this way? Is it inviting? Or is it symbolizing something that is attached to a certain narrative? Is it scary? Like, I don't know, going through Alice in Wonderland, hole in the tree, maybe it can be quite daunting, no? As opposed to maybe crossing a ring of fire. Right? We have all of these typologies like drawing with chalk and going through it. They all have all these opportunities and they all have a baggage. So we felt it's very important to have an understanding of this history, to really see all the things that a portal could do, if it's going to be this threshold, if it's going to be this door to another world. And especially we're talking about potential portals across platforms. So we're literally talking about the potential hyperlink notion. There's of course great examples of portals existing within platforms, but the tricky thing is when you are going to go through very, very different worlds and thinking of those transitions and the potential to inform and to provide an experience at the same time is really what we are very much focused on.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing research project which will unveil it at this exhibition in London, but it's ongoing and it will take many forms in the coming years, this research. Yeah.
My mind is racing because initially when you hear about portals, you're like, I've heard about the word so many times. It starts to lose its meaning, but so many things from that is interesting. One is just, I don't think people have figured out movement in the metaverse at all. Like the fact that we're still these avatars walking around in virtual space really, really slowly. That's not the way you should be transporting, right? That's not the way you get the full experience of the virtual world. But the second thing that I find interesting is this idea of what does it mean for you to cross over to a portal? What are you going into? How do you even know to go through it? Sometimes you actually have to have specific knowledge in order to get through. I was talking to a friend about actually memes almost being a bit of a portal to different worlds, because there's certain memes where you just won't understand it. You'd see it and you wouldn't even look deeper because you just have no idea what it's referencing to or the world that it opens you up to. But once you do, then it's almost like a key to a gateway of a whole entire culture and a niche. So there's so much to portals.
Yeah, we realized over the last 2 years in this research that even if the research is very focused, we're not even talking about teleportation. that's like a different thing altogether even. And we're also only looking at portals in fiction because, you know, we're very interested also in looking at portals in folklore and religion throughout the world, which hopefully the research will continue to unveil as we go deeper into this. Yeah.
And there is something really interesting you mentioned, that is means to circulate virtual space. And that is something we do a lot of work on ourselves. And also when we work with our students in university and so on, that we try and develop a lot of ideas and do a lot of research on different means to move that are not necessarily just portal or teleportation. But for example, I mean, a type of work that we do a lot of is creating spaces that are like creating virtual architecture that is basically libraries for databases, right? So how can you look at a lot of data? Basically, how can you look at a spatial diagram? When you enter a diagram, then the diagram becomes architecture. And how do you balance this project that is both architectural design, but it's also going through data or like browsing and library at the same time? So in this type of work, it's really interesting to think about different means to move that are, for example, I mean, the scale shift is really interesting. Something that we develop a lot is like suddenly you encounter a map that can also be a model of the whole place in which you are, and therefore you can point yourself to this other place. In there you have a scale shift that also, to design that transition well enough, is really tricky, right? Like how do you enter the thing? But there are beautiful examples of that. Like I always love the Google Earth bringing the bubble to your face. That's such a good one, for example, right? And also means to be in two places at the same time. We're developing some work with students as well with regards to being in a shopping environment and entering like a changing room that then allows you to exit in another place, right? And that space has served you as a threshold. So I think there are maybe a lot of things that are also about circulation that are not necessarily just the portal itself. And there are portals that, like for example, Doraemon has this brilliant portal that is the one that's where you shift scale. So it's a portal that is this big as a tunnel, and as you go through is a funnel, right? So then you shrink as you go through, which is a really good transition to eventually shift from the scale of a human, in the case of the story, to the scale of like a doll, enter a dollhouse instead, where you live. There is a lot of these devices that can enable transportation through, especially through enabling overview, scale shifts, and so on, that are super interesting. Yeah.
I can see a world where you start to get into quantum physics pretty soon too, thinking about black holes, wormholes, traveling through dimensions, all of those crazy things too. I feel like I'm just going to be pondering on these ideas for the next few days. I do want to try to ground us to a bit more of the functional and maybe utility value that the metaverse could create, because there's a lot of things that for the average person, it just completely like escapes them. They can't quite see themselves in the metaverse or really finding utility on a day-to-day basis in the virtual world quite yet. So what do you imagine as some of those things that we can provide more in the short to midterm? What are practical common spaces that you think people start to occupy? What are some of those things that are going to essentially onboard people into this experience?
It's a tricky one, because there's constantly this balance between like providing the sort of cutting edge or the sort of the newest thing is what propels the economy of the industry, that makes all of this possible. And it is still a bit hard to say what will be the sort of truly mainstream moment when not just reading about the metaverse that everyone is doing all around the world. And I guess like a good 80% of all the people that are reading about it are really bored of it because they don't ever get to experience it. What is this thing that everyone is talking about? And even a lot of people that work with it will commonly not use headsets on a daily basis. So there is this big barrier. And obviously in one way, it's just quite a significant hardware barrier that will, of course, by its natural progression over the next 10, 15 years or so, make a big difference when it's not so much of a commitment or not so much of a sort of sacrifice to actually wear the device that will make it possible. And when also all the privacy issues hopefully will be resolved in some not so harmful way. But obviously, human connections with people that you have strong relationships with in one way or another probably is the thing that will become just like in the real world, the things that, human lives are structured around work, obviously. But other than that, relationships with people that you don't just meet and then you say goodbye to, but people that are part of your life, integrately part of your life, like family or close friends. And I think when it gets to this level where there is a meaningful way of truly interacting with each other, that is not just a novelty, but where there's like a real sort of day-to-day value of having a long distance relationship or having a close relationship with a parent or a sibling or a close friend, that these technologies enable in a way that is not, again, infringing on the comforts of how we've gotten used to interacting through chatting or video call or all these things. And then when it's probably the moment relates to the project we were talking about earlier, the Venn room, where it's not so much the design of these virtual spaces, but the actual space is just where your body is. And what's transported is that other person. And we see elements in this in Meta has created all sorts of promotional material where you see like a birthday party and one person is virtual. Probably like the moment when that is truly like comfortable is when we will see this kind of big rollout of
I think it is just to be figured out. It's like, now FaceTiming is so common and it has such value, right? Whereas it was 25 years ago or something that these phones that had video, and of course nobody wanted to use those because you had to be stuck to that one place, right? So there is something that clicks and provides that comfort that I think will be the key to maybe it being or it becoming meaningful to many, many more people, and it will be through social connection. So what we are most excited about and what we are keeping our attention on is places where communities are forming, even if they're small ones, or even like places where there is really communities being built. Because to look at maps where virtual real estate is being sold, you might figure out some interesting new market structure, yes, whatever. And then they try to do activities to bring community in. And it's like, well, so that you can recreate the whole model that already exists of some kind of gentrifying virtual space. I don't know, right? Whereas it's just so wonderful to see other platforms and other places where communities are starting to really thrive. And even if they are not super huge numbers, but maybe they don't need to be, right? And that I think is the places that are starting to define what is this for, or how is this meaningful.
And when we reach that moment, obviously, within that completely new ways of communicating with each other, human to human will evolve to a point where we'll literally have kind of superpowers for literally having interactions with each other. With the research from Stanford, with homuncular flexibility, for instance, where human mind has been proven to accept new body parts, etc., when using a virtual reality headset. All of these things will enable like new forms of togetherness, and that is what's going to propel this into the future.
I love that. Where the people are, more people will come, right?
Yeah.
So you guys are pioneers in this space. It's still very new for architecture to really actively play a role in metaverse and virtual world development. How would you encourage other people to get involved? We don't have to get super deep with how you guys got into the scene, but what's the process? What are the opportunities for architects to embed themselves in the space? Or for people who are just getting interested, what are some of the routes that they can take in order to start to play a role or learn new types of skills that are relevant? Talk about the industry a little bit more.
I think finding the skill that you really want to develop is whether it is like you want to be into 3D modeling or you are more into, I don't know, like rigging, or which aspect of it are you interested in is maybe the first thing to define. Usually what we find ourselves surrounded by is people who is usually good at designing space and having the skill also to model it and so on. So it has been very interesting in the past few years to see our architecture students being so happy to be able to look for jobs in architecture offices, but also in media companies and so on. And that I think giving them, like we keep in touch with many of them, and it gives them this much wider scope and also enables them to define new roles within companies, especially when they go to work for companies. We run our own company, so we're figuring out really like what is the role that we are playing in all these different places, and seeing like what it's very interesting to see what do people think you do, like what kind of clients approach you, and that is getting more and more diverse, which is great for us. But I think finding the skill and like finding the work that you you enjoy doing and that you would like to continue doing, and then finding the communities that do so. One thing that we do also is to join any kind of whatever Discord communities for whoever is developing things that we're interested in, like immersive theater community or whatever avatar platform channel where you can follow what is going on, what they're looking for, right? What there is a need for. There are so many open pockets that sometimes are hidden quite deep. It's like when you figure out really how to search for things well on the internet. I think this is also the way, like finding the ways to find these communities is what's perhaps the best way to go about it. So you start developing connections and then seeing what kind of projects you could actually be involved in, because I think there are a lot of new roles that people doesn't even know that they exist.
And there's quite a unique moment now, or in the last 2 years or so, relates to the pandemic, but also many other developments in this space, where there are more and more conventional design commissions popping up, where architects or designers actually work more like they would for a real project, where you might have a big company that comes and says, we want a pavilion for this event in a specific metaverse platform, and where you literally have a brief to design a space. And this is something that really is changing the map completely right now. And we're also not just about finding the opportunities and building careers or building businesses around this, but maybe looping from where we started with this sort of perspective that architects often are trained to have, with having this longevity and this thinking around what you create, how it will be used over long periods of time, and what effects it has. And this is the moment where we're trying to always encourage whoever has the chance to design something virtual to really think about, even if it's only going to be used for a week, like what is truly the sort of positive impact that this space might have? Like what purpose does it really serve? Because these projects that people are creating now are going to be extremely formative for how those future careers gets built. Because some people have the chance to build many of these, but by and large, many people might not have done more than a few, and that becomes formative for how you, and then in turn the entire discipline gets created. And at the moment, we're generally being squeezed into a very, very conservative, real estate driven approach to space, which is now being applied in virtual space. And we think that this is hopefully a very short-lived, or potentially even quite dangerous for how we map some of the problems we don't want to see, problems coming from the real world about valuing land and private property, etc. And if this gets mapped too much onto the virtual environment, we might have to have a process where we again need to rethink and rebuild these spaces to make them inclusive, open, and positive for humanity in the future.
I really feel optimistic because I think the barriers are getting lowered more and more. The time to create something is just so much lower, and the time for others to derive value from it is going to be so much lower. So really hope to see that change. Last question for you guys is, what is their dream project or dream collaborators that you want to have in the future?
That's a great one. I think as again, our background is being architects, we've had the chance to both physically and virtually create like discrete bits of architecture, like a building or like an interior, but really both where there is actually the most need for really thinking hard about what the virtual environment in the metaverse is more the city planning scale, like basically thinking of, and it's something that's come up in science fiction and in all sorts of discussion, but essentially what is the civic or the public space? This, the equivalent of the street. A street metaphor is not going to work, but this is also where the portal comes in. And basically, what is the sort of the equivalent of the street, or the equivalent of the square, or the equivalent of the browser? Like the thing, the infrastructure that connects all of these spaces. That's really, I think, at least for the sort of big dream projects of like being a small part, hopefully, in trying to figure this out so that it becomes a sort of positive space where things can truly be built up over time, and not something that needs to be replaced by every new update or every new product that comes out.
I would love to see that myself as well. Well, thank you so much for all of your incredible insights. I just have so many things to think about and ponder on. I hope people can be able to check out your work, whether it's virtually or physically, but I'll make sure to include some details in the show notes.
Thank you so much, Annie, for inviting us. It was really great to meet you and talk to you about this stuff.
Yes, thanks so much for having us.
That was Lara Lesmes and Fredrik Hellberg, directors of Space Popular. You can find them on Twitter at Space Popular Or visit them at their upcoming exhibit starting June 29 called The Portal Galleries, which will take place at the Sir John Soanes Museum in London. To see their full portfolio of work, simply visit spacepopular.com. If you like this episode, please leave a review in your podcast app of choice. Thank you for listening. This is your host, Annie Zhang,